Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku became a legendary Spartan in the Battle of 300. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The wind that whipped across the rooftop was cold, a stark contrast to the fire that had just been extinguished in Izuku Midoriya's soul. It was a cruel, uncaring wind, the same that had carried All Might's booming words of departure only moments ago. But now, it only seemed to mock the suffocating silence he left behind. It's not bad to dream. But you have to be realistic. The words, spoken with a pained sort of kindness that only made them cut deeper, echoed in the hollow space where 14 years of hope had once resided. Izuku's fingers, white-knuckled, were still clenched around the strap of his yellow backpack. Inside, its pages filled with frantic, hopeful scribbles, lay hero analysis for the future, number 13. The notebook felt impossibly heavy, a tombstone for a dream he had carried since he was 4 years old. He stared out over the cityscape of Muzurifu. The familiar skyline, once a panorama of possibility and wonder, now looked like a monument to his own failure. Every gleaming tower, every distant siren, every puff of smoke from a resolved incident was a reminder of a world he could never join. He was on the outside looking in, a spectator in the only game he ever wanted to play. His legs moved before his mind did, carrying him down the stairs of the building in a numb, shuffling gait. He didn't register the clanging of the metal steps or the grimy feel of the handrail. All he could feel was the phantom weight of All Might's hand on his shoulder, and the finality in his hero's voice. The man who was the symbol of peace, the very embodiment of his aspirations, had looked him in the eye and gently, irrevocably, told him no. He was quirkless. A blank slate in a world of vibrant color. An empty vessel. A Deku. He had always known it, of course. The doctor's diagnosis, Kaken's explosive taunts, the pitying looks from his teachers, they were all constants in his life. But somewhere, deep down, a tiny, resilient flame had flickered. It was the belief that heart, that spirit, that an unyielding will to save others could be a quirk all its own. All Might had been the final gust of wind to snuff it out completely. As he walked the cracked pavement of the underpass where his day's nightmare had begun, the acrid smell of burnt sludge still hung in the air. He didn't notice. He was a ghost drifting through his own life, the world a blurry, muted backdrop. What now? What was a boy who only ever wanted to be a hero supposed to do when that path was permanently barricaded? An explosion tore through his stupor. It was a block away, a concussive boom that rattled the windows of nearby apartments. Plumes of black smoke billowed into the afternoon sky. People screamed. A familiar pattern. His legs, powered by a decade of instinct, twitched, wanting to run towards the danger, to see, to analyze, to learn. But the lesson of the day was clear. He was useless. He was a liability. He had nearly gotten All Might killed because of his foolishness. He turned to walk away, a bitter, unfamiliar taste in his mouth. Let the pros handle it. That was their job. It would never be his. But then he heard a different kind of sound. Not the roar of a villain or the confident cry of a hero, but a thin, high-pitched shriek of pure terror. It was followed by a strange, whining hum, like a million angry wasps trapped in a glass jar. Curiosity, the last dying ember of his heroic spirit, warred with his newfound despair. It was a short, brutal conflict. The ember won. He peered around the corner of a building. The scene was chaotic. Pro-heroes were establishing a perimeter, but they were keeping their distance. In the center of the street, a villain was thrashing. He wasn't large or physically imposing. He wore a ragged lab coat over a stained jumpsuit, and his eyes were wild with desperation. His body was surrounded by a shimmering, unstable vortex of violet and green light that warped the air around him. Space itself seemed to bend and ripple at his command. "Stay back!" the villain screamed, his voice cracking. "I can't control it. One more step and I'll take this whole block with me." Izuku's analytical mind, a reflex he couldn't shut off, kicked in. A space-time quirk. Highly volatile. He's not in control, which means it's likely a recent manifestation or a forced activation. He's cornered, making him unpredictable. The heroes are right to be cautious. A direct attack could trigger a catastrophic collapse. As he processed the scene, he noticed something the heroes, focused on the villain, hadn't. A small child, no older than 5, had been hiding behind a mail collection box. Now, mesmerized by the swirling lights, she toddled out from behind her cover, a half-eaten lollipop clutched in her small hand. She was directly in the path of the pulsating energy. Time slowed to a crawl. Izuku saw the widening eyes of the pro-hero Kamui Woods. He saw the child's mother scream her name from behind the police line. He saw the villain's head snap towards the new movement, his panic intensifying. "Get back!" the villain shrieked, flinging a hand out, not in attack, but in a frantic gesture to wave her away. It was a fatal mistake. The gesture sent a wave of unstable energy surging from the vortex. It wasn't a beam or a blast. It was a tear in the fabric of reality, a shimmering, silent wave of distortion that rushed towards the little girl. Izuku didn't think. He didn't weigh the options. He didn't remember that he was quirkless, useless, a failure. He only saw a person who needed saving. His legs, which had felt like lead moments before, pumped like pistons. He launched himself forward, a blur of green and black. He heard someone shout his name, or maybe it was just the wind. He shoved the little girl with all his might, sending her tumbling safely out of the path of the anomaly. He felt a brief, satisfying thud as she landed on a patch of grass on the sidewalk. Then the world dissolved. There was no pain, not at first. Just an overwhelming sensory assault. A light brighter than 1,000 suns burned away his vision, followed by a darkness deeper than the abyss. A sound like the universe screaming tore at his ears. He felt a pressure that threatened to crush his bones to dust, and simultaneously, a sensation of being stretched thin, pulled apart atom by atom across an infinite distance. Fragmented images flashed through his consciousness, his mother's worried smile, the explosive crackle of Kaken's palms, the gleaming, iconic grin of All Might. His life, a 14-year-long film, played out in a single, agonizing second. Then nothing. Just a violent, wrenching tumble through a void that was neither hot nor cold, light nor dark. And then impact. He awoke to the sensation of being cooked alive. The sun was a malevolent, white-hot eye in a sky of the most brilliant, piercing blue he had ever seen. There were no clouds, no haze of pollution, nothing to filter its oppressive glare. It beat down on him, baking the strange, dark fabric of his gakuren and drawing the moisture from his body. His head throbbed with a rhythmic, pounding agony. He tasted dirt and blood. Every breath was a sharp, stabbing reminder of what felt like a cracked rib. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his muscles screaming in protest. The world spun, a nauseating kaleidoscope of brown and green. When his vision finally cleared, his confusion only deepened. He was on a dusty, rock-strewn hillside. Gnarled olive trees with silvery green leaves clung stubbornly to the dry soil. The air was thick with the scent of hot stone, wild herbs he couldn't name, and the distant, briny tang of salt. This wasn't Nizurifu. There were no skyscrapers, no power lines, no distant hum of traffic. There was nothing but the harsh, untamed landscape, the buzzing of insects, and the relentless sun. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. Hello? He called out, his voice a dry, rasping croak. The sound was swallowed by the vast, empty space. Was this the villain's quirk? An illusion? A pocket dimension? He fumbled for his backpack, his fingers finding the familiar canvas. He pulled it into his lap. His notebook was still inside, its cover slightly singed. The mundane reality of the object was both reassuring and terrifying. He tried to stand, his legs trembling. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he sank back to the ground, panting. He was hurt, dehydrated, and utterly, completely lost. It was then that he heard it, the rhythmic crunch of sandals on gravel. Izuku's head snapped up. On the ridge above him, silhouetted against the blinding blue sky, were 3 figures. They were tall, powerfully built men with long, sun-bleached hair. They wore simple, blood-red cloaks over what looked like leather loincloths. Each man carried a large, circular shield of what looked like bronze and a terrifyingly long spear. The sun glinted off their crested helmets, obscuring their faces but not their intimidating presence. They looked like they had walked straight out of one of his history textbooks. Izuku's mind, the ever-present analyst, tried to make sense of it. Cosplayers? A historical reenactment group. But out here? And their equipment, it doesn't look like props. The bronze has the patina of age, the leather is worn and oiled, their bodies, they're covered in scars. The men began to descend the ridge, their movements fluid and predatory. They didn't speak, but moved with an unnerving, silent coordination. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. These were not cosplayers. There was a hardness in their posture, a lethal efficiency in their gait that spoke of a life of constant violence. He scrambled backwards, his hands scraping against the sharp rocks. Please, he stammered in Japanese. I don't mean any harm. I'm lost. The lead man, who seemed to be the oldest, held up a hand, and the trio stopped about 20 feet away. He studied Izuku with an unnervingly intense gaze. His face was a mask of hard lines, tanned and weathered by the sun, with a thick, untamed beard. He barked a single, sharp word in a language Izuku had never heard. It was guttural, harsh, and utterly incomprehensible. I don't understand, Izuku whispered, holding up his hands in a universal gesture of peace. The man's eyes narrowed. He gestured with his spear towards Izuku's clothing. Another man, younger and with a more volatile look in his eyes, muttered something to the leader, his hand tightening on his own spear. He looked ready to hurl it. Izuku's fear was a cold, solid knot in his stomach. He was injured, helpless, and facing 3 armed men who clearly saw him as a threat or an oddity to be eliminated. His quirklessness had never felt so profound. There was no clever strategy, no hidden power that would save him now. But his instinct for self-preservation, the one that screamed at him to run, was overridden by another, more deeply ingrained one, the desire to de-escalate, to understand. He had to show them he wasn't a threat. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself into a kneeling position, then bowed his head low, his forehead nearly touching the dusty ground. It was a gesture of ultimate deference in his culture, a sign of respect and submission. He stayed there, motionless, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the earth. He heard the men murmuring. The sounds were clipped, questioning. The seconds stretched into an eternity. He could feel the leader's gaze on him, dissecting him. He was a puzzle. His strange, soft black tunic and trousers, the yellow box on his back, his unnaturally green hair, his bizarre speech, and now this strange act of prostration. Finally, he heard the crunch of sandals approaching. A shadow fell over him. He risked a glance upwards. The leader stood over him, the point of his spear just inches from Izuku's throat. The man's eyes, a surprisingly light shade of gray, were like chips of flint. They held no malice, but also no compassion. It was a purely pragmatic assessment, a farmer deciding if a strange new plant was a weed or a curiosity. The man spoke again, his voice a low rumble. He gestured with his head, a clear command to stand. Izuku obeyed, rising slowly, his hands still held up and open. The man grunted and then, with the butt of his spear, nudged Izuku's shoulder. The message was clear: walk. The 2 other men fell in behind him, their spears held ready. They were his captors. He had no choice but to comply. As they began to march, the leader pointed at him and spoke to his companions. The word he used was unfamiliar, but he repeated it several times, a label. Izuku didn't know it then, but his life as Izuku Midoriya had ended the moment that villain's quirk had touched him. His new life, a brutal, terrifying, and altogether impossible one, was just beginning. The march was a grueling ordeal. The sun was relentless, and the terrain was unforgiving. Izuku's modern, rubber-soled sneakers, designed for the flat pavement of a city, offered poor grip on the rocky goat paths they traversed. He stumbled often, earning irritated grunts from his escorts. They offered him no water and no rest, their pace steady and relentless. Despite his fear and pain, Izuku's analytical mind began to work, a desperate attempt to impose logic on an illogical situation. He observed his captors. They called each other by name. The leader was Lycoergos, the hot-headed one Damas, and the third, quietest one was Nicandros. They spoke in short, efficient sentences. Their discipline was absolute. When they paused to get their bearings, they formed a protective triangle around him without a word being spoken. This was no theme park. This was real. The smell of their sweat, the glint of real, sharpened bronze, the casual way they carried weapons that could kill him in an instant. It was all terrifyingly, impossibly real. Time travel? The thought was insane, a fantasy from a science fiction manga. But as they crested a hill and he saw the valley spread before them, the insane started to feel like the only possible explanation. Below them lay not a city of glass and steel, but a settlement of stark, functional buildings made of stone, wood, and clay. It was nestled in a plain between two towering mountain ranges. There were no paved roads, only well-trodden dirt paths. He could see people moving about, many of them clad in the same simple tunics and cloaks as his captors. In the distance, groups of boys, stripped to the waist, were engaged in what looked like a violent, full-contact brawl, their bodies already corded with muscle. It was Sparta. Or at least, a place so convinced it was Sparta that the distinction didn't matter. As they entered the outskirts of the settlement, they became a spectacle. People stopped and stared. Faces, hard and suspicious, turned towards him. They didn't point and gasp like tourists. They watched him with the wary eyes of a people who knew that anything strange could be a threat. Their murmurs followed him, a wave of incomprehensible whispers. Lycoergos led him through the unadorned streets, past simple homes and open-air workshops where blacksmiths hammered bronze into spearheads. The air smelled of wood smoke, livestock, and unwashed bodies. It was a world away from the clean, sanitized environment of 21st century Japan. It was raw, primitive, and alive. Izuku felt like an alien exhibit. His black gakuren, now filthy with dust and sweat, his bright red shoes, and most of all, his shock of broccoli green hair, marked him as something completely other. A woman carrying a water jug stopped and made a gesture with her hand, warding off evil, he guessed. Finally, Lycoergos halted before a larger, but no less austere, building. He spoke to the two guards at the entrance, who looked at Izuku with open disbelief before one of them disappeared inside. While they waited, Lycoergos decided to try and communicate again. He pointed to himself. Lycoergos. Spartiates. He then pointed at Izuku, his expression a mixture of demand and curiosity. He was asking for his name and origin. Izuku, he said, pointing to his own chest. Izuku Midoriya. Lycoergos tried to repeat it. The sounds were alien to his tongue. Izuku? It came out as a harsh, mangled sound. Damas snorted in derision. Lycoergos frowned, giving up on the difficult name. His gaze settled on Izuku's most prominent features, his messy green hair and his wide, emerald green eyes. The color was unusual here, where most were dark-haired and dark-eyed. It was the color of new spring leaves, of unripened olives. He spoke a word, not to Izuku, but to his companions, as if settling on a designation. Chloros. Damas nodded in agreement. Chloros. The green one. The pale one. It was a simple, descriptive label. A name for a thing they had found. Izuku didn't understand the word, but he understood the intent. They had given him a name. It was another layer of his old identity being stripped away, replaced by something foreign. The guard returned and gestured for them to enter. Izuku was prodded forward into a large, torch-lit hall. Seated on simple but sturdy wooden chairs were 5 old men. Their faces were like ancient maps, etched with the lines of countless years and hardships. Their eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. These were the Ephors, the elected leaders of Sparta. Lycoergos began to speak, his voice formal and respectful. He recounted the story of finding the boy, gesturing to Izuku to illustrate his points. He indicated his strange clothes, mimicked his incomprehensible speech, and demonstrated the odd bowing gesture. He held up Izuku's backpack, which they had taken from him, presenting it like a piece of evidence. One of the Ephors, a man with a long, white beard and eyes that seemed to see right through him, took the backpack. He handled it with caution, his gnarled fingers fumbling with the plastic zipper. When it slid open with a soft zipping sound, he and the other elders flinched back as if it were a snake. He peered inside, pulling out the hero analysis notebook. He opened it. His eyes widened slightly as he saw the neatly written Japanese characters and the detailed, technical drawings of heroes. To him, it was not analysis. It was cryptic symbols and strange icons, the work of a scribe or a sorcerer. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more severe. He passed it to the others, who murmured amongst themselves. The head Effer then leveled his gaze at Izuku. The silence in the hall was heavy, thick with judgment. He spoke, his voice like the grinding of stones, the words directed at Lycoergos, but his eyes locked on the boy. Izuku couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were deciding his fate. He was an omen, a stray, a potential threat from an unknown land. A slave's collar, a sacrificial knife, a quick death in a ditch, all seemed like plausible outcomes. He stood there, alone and terrified, under the gaze of 5 men who held his life in their hands. His dream of being a hero had died on a rooftop in Muzurifu. Now, it seemed his life would end in a dusty, torchlit hall in a time and place he didn't belong. The name they had given him echoed in his mind, a final, definitive stamp on his new reality. He was no longer Izuku. He was Chloros. And he was a complete and utter anomaly in the brutal, unforgiving world of Sparta. Whether he would be allowed to survive in it was a question to which he had no answer. 6 months. 183 days since the sky had torn open and spat him out onto the unforgiving soil of Laconia. 6 months of scorching sun, of strange, coarse food, and of a language that had at first sounded like stones rattling in a helmet. Izuku Midoriya, the boy who dreamed of heroes, was gone. In his place stood Chloros, the green-eyed omen, a ward of the Spartan state. He was not a slave. That much had been decided in the weeks following his arrival. The Effers, after long deliberation, had deemed him too strange, too much of an unknown to be simply put to work in a field or a mine. His notebook, filled with its cryptic glyphs and intricate drawings, had marked him as something other. Was he a madman? A divine messenger? The touched-in-the-head son of some distant, unknown king? They did not know, and in Sparta, the unknown was a thing to be tested, not discarded, and so he existed in a state of limbo. He was housed in a communal barracks, fed the same meager rations as the other state wards and low-born Spartiates, and assigned menial tasks. His primary keeper was Lycoergos, the gruff hoplite who had found him. The man taught him, not out of kindness, but out of a pragmatic need to make the boy useful. Lycoergos would point at an object and bark its name in the harsh, clipped Doric dialect. Dori. Spear. Aspes. Shield. Chronos. Helmet. Polemo. War. Izuku, with his analyst's mind honed by years of studying quirks, absorbed it all with a desperate fervor. Language was survival. He filled a new, crudely made parchment notebook, a gift from a curious but silent blacksmith, with phonetic approximations of the words, linking them to sketches. His speech was still halting, his accent thick and strange, but he could understand. He could obey. He could survive. Survival was a lesson taught daily. He learned that the bland, gritty barley paste was a blessing, that a full stomach was a luxury, and that the black broth, a foul-smelling concoction of pork, salt, vinegar, and blood called melas zomos, was the celebrated taste of a true warrior. He learned that pain was a constant companion, and complaining about it was a weakness more shameful than the pain itself. His old life felt like a dream, a half-remembered myth. His mother's warm smile, the taste of Katsudon, the gleaming towers of Muzurifu, they were ghosts that haunted the edges of his sleep. He clung to them, but each sunrise in this harsh, primitive land made them fade a little more. The only thing that remained sharp and clear was the crushing finality of All Might's words. In a way, this brutal world was a fitting reflection of how he'd felt on that rooftop, stripped of all hope, left with nothing but the raw, aching need to endure. His fate, however, could not remain in limbo forever. One cool morning, he was summoned once more before the 5 Effers. He stood on the stone floor, his oversized, rough-spun tunic itching his skin, and waited. The old men studied him, their gazes as sharp and penetrating as ever. He was taller now, the baby fat of his middle school years burned away by manual labor and a sparse diet, leaving behind a frame of lean, wiry muscle. But he was still small, soft-looking compared to the granite-hewn men of this land. The head Effer, a man named Jaren, finally spoke. His voice was dry as dust. Chloros, he began, the name now as familiar to Izuku's ears as his own. You have learned our words. You have eaten our food. You have obeyed. But you have no place. You are not Helot, not Perioica. To live in Lacedaemon, you must serve it. And there is only one way to truly serve. Jaren leaned forward, his ancient eyes boring into Izuku's. You are old. Nearly a man by our count. The others begin their training at 7 summers. You have missed 10. But the strength of Sparta is the phalanx, and the phalanx has no room for the untested. The crucible that forges our men will either make you a Spartan, or it will break you. Tomorrow, you enter the Agoge. A cold dread, colder than any he had felt since his arrival, washed over Izuku. The Agoge. He had seen it, heard of it. It was the legendary, state-sponsored education and training regimen that all male Spartan citizens were forced to complete. It was a machine designed to strip away individuality and forge perfect, unthinking soldiers. It was a life of systematic deprivation, brutal competition, and relentless violence. Boys entered at 7. Many did not survive to manhood. He was to be thrown into this meat grinder at 15, a lamb amongst wolves. There was no refusing. In Sparta, the word of an Ephor was second only to law itself. He could only bow his head, the movement stiff with fear, and utter the single word of acceptance he had been taught. Yes, Ephor. As he was led away, he overheard one of the other Ephors murmur to Jaren, "It is a waste of resources. The foreign boy is soft. He will not last a moon." Jaren's reply was chilling in its pragmatism. Then the wolves will have their meat, and the question of what to do with him will be answered. The courtyard of the Agoge was a patch of sun-baked earth, packed hard by the bare feet of 1,000 boys over 100 years. It smelled of sweat, dust, and blood. Here, there was no rank but strength, no authority but the paidonomos, the instructor, and the switches of corporal punishment he carried. Izuku stood in a line with a group of boys his age, all of whom towered over him. They had been in this system for a decade. Their bodies were already slabs of hardened muscle, their skin a tapestry of scars from training and ritualized combat. They looked at him with open contempt. He was the outsider, the oddity, the chloros. His green hair was a beacon of his otherness. The paidonomos was a man named Lycomedes. He was a veteran of some long-forgotten border skirmish, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of wood with a dull axe. A thick, jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He walked down the line of boys, his obsidian eyes missing nothing. When he reached Izuku, he stopped. "So," Lycomedes grunted, his voice a low growl. "The Ephors have sent me a stray dog. Look at you. All bones and big eyes. What use can Sparta have for you?" Izuku stood rigid, his eyes fixed forward as he had been taught. He did not speak. Lycomedes circled him slowly, like a predator assessing strange prey. "They say you are clever. That you scribble in a book like a pampered Athenian." He tapped Izuku's head with the end of his switch. It wasn't a hard tap, but it was deeply insulting. Cleverness does not hold a shield wall. Words do not stop a Persian arrow. Here you are nothing. He moved to stand in front of Izuku again. "Here you will learn to be something. Or you will be returned to the dirt from whence you came. What is your name, stray?" "Chloros, master," Izuku said, his voice quiet but steady. A muscular boy with a shock of blonde hair and an arrogant smirk, the clear leader of the group, let out a short, barking laugh. His name was Phoebus, and Izuku had already identified him as the primary source of his future suffering. "Chloros?" Phoebus sneered, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "He doesn't look like new growth. He looks clumsy. He stumbles when he walks." He spoke a series of quick, guttural words in the local dialect, a pun on Izuku's name and his perceived weakness. Lycomedes didn't reprimand Phoebus. He even allowed a faint, cruel smile to touch his lips. He turned back to Izuku. "He is right. You are clumsy. You are weak. You are useless until proven otherwise." He then said the word. The one word that made Izuku's blood run cold, a ghost from a past he thought he'd left a world away. Deku. It wasn't the same Japanese word, of course. It was a coincidence of sound, a Spartan colloquialism Phoebus had just coined that meant something akin to one who is unable, or the stumbling block, a useless puppet. But to Izuku, the meaning was identical. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had crossed time and space, endured starvation and fear, only to be branded with the same name, the same curse, that had defined his quirkless life. A wave of despair, so potent it made him dizzy, washed over him. He flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but Lycomedes saw it. The instructor's smile widened. Ah. So the Stray understands that name. It suits you. From this day you are Deku. The other boys laughed. The name stuck instantly. Chloros was forgotten. He was Deku, the useless one. The training that followed was a blur of agony. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, and then they were whipped until they got up and ran again. They wrestled in the dirt, the goal not just to pin, but to dominate, to inflict pain. Izuku, with his lean frame, was thrown around like a sack of grain. His body, which had started to harden from manual labor, was no match for the trained musculature of his peers. Phoebus made him a special project. In every sparring session, he would seek Izuku out. He wouldn't just defeat him, he would humiliate him. He'd use his superior strength and skill to disarm Izuku, knock him to the ground, and then hold him there, grinding his face into the dirt, while the others jeered. Is this your Athenian cleverness, Deku? Phoebus would grunt, a knee pressed hard into Izuku's back. Does it tell you how the dust tastes? Every day ended with Izuku a mess of bruises, scrapes, and shattered pride. He would drag his aching body back to the barracks, collapse onto his simple straw pallet, and stare into the darkness. The despair was a living thing, a creature with cold claws that gripped his heart. The Epha's words echoed in his ears. The wolves will have their meat. He was being devoured piece by piece. But even as his body was broken down, a part of his mind, the stubborn, analytical core of him, refused to surrender. One night, nursing a particularly nasty set of bruised ribs, a switch flipped. He was tired of being a victim. He was tired of the pain. If he couldn't win with his body, he would have to find another way. The flame that All Might had extinguished hadn't died, it had just been buried under a mountain of ash. And now, a single, defiant spark was glowing in the dark. He couldn't be a hero in the way he dreamed. But he could survive. And to survive, he needed to think. He began his new notebook. Spartan analysis for the future. During the brutal daytime drills, while his body was screaming, a part of his mind detached, observing, recording. He started mumbling again, a habit he tried to suppress. It earned him more blows from Lycomedes and more mockery from the others, but he couldn't stop. It was how he processed information. His first entry, written by the flickering light of a stolen tallow candle, was on Phoebus. Subject: Phoebus. Strength: overwhelming. Speed: deceptive. Technique: polished but aggressive. Weaknesses: arrogance. He overcommits on his initial charge, leaving his left side exposed for a fraction of a second after his initial shield bash. He relies on brute force to end fights quickly. His stamina has never been truly tested in a prolonged engagement. He telegraphs his overhead strike by slightly dipping his right shoulder. Predictable. He started analyzing everyone. Lycomedes, who watched his students' feet, not their weapons, to anticipate their movements. The other boys, each with their own tells, their own strengths and weaknesses. He drew diagrams of wrestling holds, noting leverage points and counters. He sketched the standard phalanx formation, running calculations in his head about angles of attack, pressure points, and structural vulnerabilities. His mind, starved for the complex stimulus of his old life, feasted on this new, brutal data. The Agoj was a system, and like any system, it had rules and exploits. He wasn't just a participant anymore. He was a student of the game itself. His body was still a liability, but it was slowly adapting. The constant exertion was forging his muscles into dense, powerful cords. The meager food taught his metabolism an unforgiving efficiency. The pain taught him endurance. He was still smaller, still weaker, but he was no longer soft. He was becoming like a river stone, smooth on the surface, but impossibly hard beneath. His first breakthrough came a few months later, during a one-on-one sparring session with wooden swords and small practice shields. His opponent was a boy named Demetrios, not as strong as Phoebus but still leagues ahead of where Izuku had started. As the match began, Demetrios charged, just as Izuku's analysis predicted he would, a straightforward, aggressive rush. Izuku didn't try to meet him head-on. Instead, he took a half-step back, absorbing the impact of the shield bash on the reinforced edge of his own buckler, letting the force slide past him. It was a move he'd practiced in his mind 1,000 times. Demetrios, overbalanced, stumbled forward. For a split second, his side was exposed. Izuku didn't go for a powerful, winning blow. He didn't have the strength for that. Instead, he pivoted and drove the hilt of his wooden sword into the sensitive spot just above Demetrios's hip. The boy grunted in pain and surprise, his follow-up swing going wide. Izuku didn't press the attack. He retreated, creating distance, his shield held high. His heart was hammering. It worked. It actually worked. The fight became a frustrating dance for Demetrios. Every time he charged, Izuku would sidestep, parry, or redirect, using his opponent's momentum against him. He never landed a decisive blow, but he landed a dozen small, irritating ones, a rap on the knuckles, a jab to the thigh, a pommel strike to the ribs. He was a gadfly, impossible to swat. Demetrios grew angrier, sloppier. His swings became wild, his footwork clumsy. Finally, in a fit of rage, he lunged with a desperate, overhead strike. It was the exact move Izuku had been waiting for. He dropped low, sweeping his leg out, a move from a wrestling drill, not a sword fight. Demetrios, his balance already compromised, tumbled over Izuku's leg and landed flat on his back with a loud oof. Izuku immediately placed the point of his wooden sword on the boy's throat. The courtyard was silent. No one, least of all Demetrios, could believe it. The weakling, the stumbling block, Deku had won. He hadn't won through strength, but through infuriating cleverness and endurance. Lycomedes stared at him, his scarred face unreadable. He walked over and looked down at the defeated Demetrios, then at Izuku, who was panting, his body trembling with adrenaline. The goal is to defeat your opponent, not annoy him into submission, Lycomedes grumbled, but there was no heat in his words. He nudged Demetrios with his boot. Get up. You were beaten by a stray's tricks. Let that be a lesson. He glanced at Izuku one last time, a flicker of something, not respect, but perhaps professional interest, in his dark eyes before he moved on. Phoebus glared at him from across the yard, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had not been defeated, but his worldview had been challenged. Izuku walked away from the duel with his head held high for the first time. He had won. He hadn't just survived a fight, he had controlled it. The name still stung, but for the first time, he felt he might be able to redefine it. Perhaps Deku could mean something else. Not one who is unable, but one who can do it, just differently. The ultimate test came during the Cryptia, a yearly survival of the fittest training exercise for the older boys. They were divided into 2 teams, or Eli, and sent into the rugged foothills of Mount Aegitus. The objective was simple and brutal. One team was tasked with defending a position, a hilltop marked by a pole bearing an old, crested helmet. The other team had to capture it. There were no rules save one: do not permanently maim or kill your fellow Spartan. Everything else was permitted. Lycomedes, with a glint of cruel amusement in his eye, assigned the teams. Phoebus was made the leader of the attacking team, comprised of the 15 strongest, fastest, and most aggressive boys. The defending team was led by a sullen boy named Alceus, and it was made up of the leftovers. The younger boys, the slower ones, the less promising students. And, of course, Izuku. They were 12 defenders against 15 elite attackers. It wasn't a training exercise, it was a foregone conclusion, designed to teach the weaker boys humility through overwhelming defeat. As they trudged up the hill to their defensive position, morale was already shattered. It's pointless, Alceus muttered, kicking a loose stone. Phoebus and his wolves will be upon us before midday. We'll be lucky to hold them for an hour. The others murmured in agreement. But Izuku was scanning the terrain, his mind racing. He saw the steep, rocky incline on the northern face, the dense patch of thorny bushes to the east, the gentler, more open slope to the west where the main path lay. He was mumbling, his eyes darting back and forth, calculating angles, sight lines, and possibilities. What are you muttering about, Deku? Alceus snapped. Praying to your foreign gods? No, Izuku said, turning to him. His voice was surprisingly firm. I am thinking. We can win this. A round of skeptical snorts went through the small group. Win? Alceus laughed humorlessly. Did you not see them? They are 15. We are 12. They have Phoebus. We have you. That's why we will win, Izuku insisted, a fire in his eyes. He unrolled a piece of parchment he'd brought, upon which he'd already sketched a rough map of the hill. He knelt, and the others, intrigued despite themselves, gathered around. Phoebus is arrogant, Izuku began, his finger tracing lines on the map. He thinks like a hammer. He will see the main path on the west slope and assume we will build our defense there. He will expect a miniature phalanx, a straightforward shield wall he can smash through with superior numbers. We will not give him that. His plan was simple in its concept, but complex in its execution. It was a strategy of deception and misdirection. We build a decoy defense here, he said, pointing to the main path. A weak-looking wall of stones and branches. 4 of us will defend it, including you, Alceus. You are strong. You must make them believe our entire force is there. You must make a show of it, then conduct a fighting retreat. Retreat? A Spartan does not retreat. Another boy protested. A Spartan wins, Izuku countered sharply. This is not a real battle. This is a game of wits. While you draw their main force, the rest of us will be hidden. 2 here, he pointed to the thorny bushes, and 6 of us, the main group, here, on the northern rocks. He looked at them, his gaze intense. Phoebus will see the retreat, and his pride will take over. He will order his whole force to charge up the main path to claim the summit. When they pass the thorns, our 2 ambushers will strike their rear, causing confusion. As they reach the summit, expecting an easy victory, our main force will descend from the rocks and crash into their exposed flank. We will hit them from 2 sides when they are disorganized and exhausted from climbing. We will use gravity and surprise as our weapons. The boys were silent, staring at the map. The plan was unorthodox. It was un-Spartan. It relied on trickery, not head-on courage. But it was also brilliant. Alceus looked at Izuku, his usual disdain replaced by a grudging curiosity. And if Phoebus does not take the bait? If he sends scouts? He won't, Izuku said with absolute certainty. Because his biggest weakness is that he cannot imagine being outthought by me. For the first time, a few of the boys smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile. The plan gave them something they hadn't had before, a chance. Alceus stared at Izuku for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. We will do it. The plan went into motion. The decoy wall was built. The ambushers, armed with slings and stones, disappeared into the thorny brush. Izuku led the main force, including a large, quiet boy named Agesilaus who was strong but slow-witted, up the treacherous northern rocks, hiding them from view. Hours passed. The sun beat down. Then, a horn blast echoed from below. The attack had begun. Shouts and the clash of wood on wood drifted up from the western slope. Alceus and his small group were putting on a magnificent performance, yelling challenges and holding their ground with a ferocity that belied their numbers. Then, as planned, they began to fall back, fighting for every inch, drawing Phoebus's force up the hill. From his perch, Izuku saw it all unfold. Phoebus, at the head of his pack, was exactly the hammer Izuku had predicted. He urged his team on, hungry for the kill. They were a single, powerful mass, focused entirely on the retreating defenders. As they passed the thorny thicket, a volley of stones rained down on their rearguard. The ambushers yelled and crashed through the brush, causing chaos before melting back into the foliage. Phoebus, irritated but undeterred, yelled at his men to ignore the gnats and press the charge. He had taken the bait. The 15 attackers stormed the summit, shields high, only to find it empty save for the helmet on its pole. For a moment, they stood in confused triumph. Now! Izuku screamed. With a roar that was part terror and part exhilaration, his 6-man force scrambled down from the rocks, a small avalanche of bodies and wooden spears. They slammed into the flank of Phoebus's team with the force of a battering ram. Agesilaus, with Izuku's instructions ringing in his ears, didn't even try to fight. He simply lowered his shoulder and plowed into the center of the enemy formation like a runaway bull. shattering their cohesion. At the same moment, Alceus's group, their feigned retreat finished, turned and charged back up the hill, hitting the attackers from the front. Phoebus's force, caught completely by surprise, trapped between two forces and utterly disorganized, fell into chaos. The battle was short and brutal. It was no longer 15 against 12. It was a confused mob being systematically dismantled. In the swirling melee, Izuku didn't fight like a warrior. He moved like a battlefield controller, shouting directions. Agesilaus, left. 2 of them. Alceus, hold the center. Don't let them reform. Phoebus, enraged, finally spotted him. DKU! He bellowed, shoving his way through the chaos. He charged at Izuku, his face a mask of fury. Izuku stood his ground, shield up. He knew he couldn't beat him. He just had to survive him. He dodged the first wild swing, parried the second, his arm screaming from the impact. But as Phoebus raised his sword for a final, crushing blow, Agesilaus, having dispatched his own opponents, slammed into Phoebus from the side, sending the arrogant leader sprawling. Before Phoebus could recover, Alceus had snatched the helmet from its pole. He held it high. Victory! He roared. It was over. The impossible had happened. The 12 had defeated the 15. Lycomedes appeared at the edge of the summit, having watched the entire engagement from a hidden vantage point. He surveyed the scene, the triumphant, bruised defenders and the utterly humiliated attackers. His gaze fell on Phoebus, who was being helped to his feet, his face thunderous. Then, his eyes settled on Izuku. He walked over to the boy, who was leaning on his spear, trying to catch his breath. The instructor stood before him, his expression as hard as ever. But his eyes held a new light. The stray dog, Lycomedes said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the silent hilltop, has teeth. He didn't offer praise. He didn't smile. But for a Spartan like Lycomedes, it was the highest commendation. He looked at the group of victorious boys, who were now looking at Izuku with something approaching awe. You won today not because you were stronger, but because you did not think like Spartans, the instructor declared. You used the mind of a fox, not the heart of a lion. There is a lesson in that. Victory forgives many sins of method. He turned and walked away, leaving them to their triumph. As they made their way back to the barracks, no one called him Deku. They called him Chloros. Some even tried to pronounce Izuku. Alceus walked beside him, a new, grudging respect in his eyes. That night, for the first time, Izuku Midoriya did not dream of the past. He did not dream of Mizurufu or All Might. He dreamed of shield walls and battle plans, of a future he was forging for himself with his own mind and will. He was still an outsider, still a boy from another world. But here, in the heart of the most brutal warrior society in history, he had found the one thing he had always been denied, a place where his unique brand of strength had value. He had found a way to be a hero, not with a quirk, but with a plan. The years passed, not like the turning pages of a calendar, but like the slow, deliberate sharpening of a blade against a whetstone. Each day was a grind, stripping away another layer of softness, honing a sharper, harder edge. The boy who fell from the sky, the pale, green-eyed Chloros, the clumsy Deku, was worn away by the relentless friction of the Agoge. In his place, a man was forged. Izuku turned 20. By the standards of his old world, he was just entering adulthood. In Sparta, he was a veteran of a war that never ended, the war against the self. His body, once lean and wiry, had thickened with the dense, functional muscle of a lifelong warrior. He was not a giant like some of his peers, but every inch of him was conditioned for endurance and efficiency. Scars, the currency of Spartan masculinity, cross-hatched his arms and torso, a pale white line on his cheek from a careless sparring sword, a puckered mark on his thigh from a boar tusk during a hunt in the Taygetus Mountains, and countless smaller nicks and scrapes that were the mundane grammar of his daily life. He was no longer the best strategist. He was simply the strategist. The victory at the Cryptia had not been a fluke. It had been the public unveiling of a mind that worked on a different axis from everyone else's. While his peers learned to perfect the phalanx, Izuku learned to deconstruct it. While they trained to be the unbreakable spear, he trained his mind to be the unseen hand that guided it. His mumbling, once a source of mockery, was now listened to with a grudging, almost fearful respect. When Chloros mumbled, a plan was being born, a complex tapestry of cause and effect that others could only see after it had already ensnared them. His notebooks, now numerous and bound in stiff leather, were his most prized possessions. They were filled with the elegant, alien script of his homeland, but the diagrams were universal, sketches of shield wall fulcrums, flanking maneuvers based on the hunting patterns of wolves, logistical plans for supplying a troop on the march, and psychological analyses of his fellow Spartans. He knew who would break first in a shield lock, who was prone to anger, and who could be relied upon to hold the line no matter the cost. He knew them better than they knew themselves. The heat of the Laconian summer had settled over the valley, a thick, shimmering blanket that made the air buzz with the drone of cicadas. In the training yard of the Syssitia, the communal mess hall where Izuku and his shield brothers ate and lived, the dust rose in lazy puffs under the impact of their bare feet. The day was brutally ordinary, a perfect replica of the 1,000 days that had come before it. Izuku, or Chloros, as he was known to all but his closest friends, moved in a familiar rhythm. He was sparring with Agesilaus, a dance as ingrained in his muscle memory as breathing. Agesilaus was the mountain, a creature of pure, granite strength. His attacks were straightforward and devastating, each swing of his wooden practice sword carrying enough force to splinter bone. Izuku was the river, never meeting the mountain head-on, but flowing around it, weathering it down. He sidestepped, parried, and redirected, his movements economical and precise, his analytical mind a full second ahead of the action. "You think too much," Agesilaus grunted, his broad chest heaving with effort as he launched a powerful overhead strike. Izuku ducked under the blow, the wind of its passage stirring his green hair. He swept a leg behind Agesilaus' ankle, not to trip the giant, an impossible feat, but to disrupt his balance for a fraction of a second. It was enough. He brought the flat of his own blade up in a sharp rap against the back of Agesilaus' thigh. "And you," Izuku panted, a rare smile touching his lips, "think too little." Agesilaus let out a booming laugh, lowering his sword. "Thinking is what we have you for, little brother. My job is to hit what you point at." Dilios, leaning against the sun-warmed column and ostensibly observing the match, was in fact composing. His fingers plucked at an imaginary lyre as he half sang, half spoke in a low, dramatic tone. "And the mighty oak did swing its branch, to crush the reed so green. But the reed it bent, and with a flick, struck the oak's great trunk, unseen." "Your poetry is getting worse," Izuku noted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Nonsense," Dilios said with a theatrical flourish. "It is an epic in the making. The tale of the Emerald Hoplite. It lacks a suitably tragic ending, but I feel one is just over the horizon. The gods love a good tragedy." His words, meant in jest, hung in the heavy air. The horizon was indeed dark. For months, rumors had slithered down from the north, whispers carried by traders and messengers from other city-states. They spoke of a shadow rising in the east, a storm of unimaginable size. Xerxes, the god-king of Persia, had amassed an army not of men, but of locusts, a swarm so vast it drank rivers dry and ate entire harvests as it moved. He sought to finish what his father, Darius, had failed to do at Marathon a decade earlier, to grind Greece under the heel of the Persian Empire. The rumors were too vast, too epic, to feel real. They were like the tales of gods and monsters Dilios loved to spin. But the Spartans, pragmatic to a fault, had begun to sharpen their spears with a little more care, to hold their shield drills with a grim new intensity. "Do you think they will truly come?" Agesilaus asked, his jovial expression hardening into the stoic mask of a Spartan warrior. "They will," Izuku said quietly, his gaze distant. He had spent his nights poring over merchants' maps and interrogating traveling periodically, trying to comprehend the scale of the threat. The numbers he extrapolated were terrifying, so large they were almost meaningless. Hundreds of thousands. Perhaps more. An army that large has its own momentum. It cannot be stopped. It can only be met. As if summoned by his words, the sound of a horn cut through the afternoon haze. It was not the familiar call to assembly or the signal for a drill. It was a sharp, urgent blast from the city's main gate, a sound reserved for the arrival of important dignitaries or dire news. The three men exchanged a look. The sparring was forgotten. They grabbed their crimson cloaks, the Phoenicians, the uniform of a Spartiate at peace, and joined the stream of other men heading towards the city's central square. A crowd was already gathering, a sea of red cloaks and hard, questioning faces. In the center of the square, before the stern, unadorned building where the ephors held council, stood a spectacle of jarring opulence. A contingent of foreign soldiers stood stiffly at attention, their armor a gaudy mix of polished brass scales and brightly colored linen. Their faces were dark, their beards intricately braided and oiled. They were Persians. At their head stood an envoy, a man whose arrogance was as loud as his attire. He was draped in robes of Tyrian purple and brilliant saffron silk, his fingers heavy with gold rings. A translator, a nervous-looking Greek from one of the subjugated Ionian cities, stood beside him. Izuku watched them, his analytical mind processing the scene with an unsettling clarity. In his old world, he had seen pictures, even videos, of ancient Persian reliefs. These men were living history, walking out of a textbook and into his reality. But he didn't feel a scholar's wonder. He felt a cold, primal dread. He saw not just soldiers, but the vanguard of an imperial machine, a system of conquest so vast and organized it dwarfed anything the fragmented Greek city-states could imagine. He saw the cold logic of empire and the envoy's sneering gaze. King Leonidas emerged from the council hall, flanked by the 5 ephors. He was not a tall man, but he possessed a density of presence that seemed to bend the light around him. His long, dark hair was streaked with gray, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore the same simple red cloak as every other Spartan, yet on him, it seemed a king's raiment. His eyes, chips of obsidian, fixed on the Persian envoy. The envoy bowed, a shallow, dismissive gesture. Through his translator, his voice dripped with condescension. I bring greetings from the King of Kings, the great King, Xerxes, ruler of all lands from the rising to the setting sun. He is a generous king, he has heard of the courage of Sparta, and he offers you a place in his new world. A low murmur rippled through the assembled Spartans, a sound like gravel grinding on stone. Leonidas remained silent, his expression unreadable. The envoy smiled, mistaking their silence for awe. The great king's generosity is boundless. He does not wish to lay waste to your lands or salt your fields. He asks for only a token of your submission, a symbol that you understand the new order of things. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping over the crowd of hard-faced warriors. He asks for your earth and your water. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, the calm before a lightning strike. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. Izuku could feel the tension coil in the muscles of every man around him. They were a nation of predators, and this silk-clad fool had just walked into their den and demanded they bare their throats. Izuku found himself holding his breath. He knew, from the fragmented history he remembered, what was supposed to happen. But living it was different. The sheer, palpable rage emanating from the men around him was a physical force. The envoy, oblivious, took a step forward. A wise king knows when to bow to a greater one. Your choice is simple, a bowl of dirt and a cup of water, or a mountain of your own dead. Give us our tribute, and we shall leave you in peace. Leonidas finally moved. He took a single, deliberate step forward. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was low, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the sound of a tombstone being set in place. You come to our city, Leonidas began, his eyes locked on the envoys, wearing the wealth of slaves and speaking the words of a tyrant. You speak of generosity, but you offer only chains. You speak of peace, but you bring only the threat of war. He took another step. The Persian soldiers shifted nervously, their hands moving towards the hilts of their curved swords. You ask for our earth and our water, Leonidas continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a menacing rumble. Here in Sparta, we have a custom for those who demand such things. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on a deep, stone-lined well in the corner of the square, used for public water. A dark, gaping mouth in the earth. His eyes then returned to the envoy, and for the first time, a flicker of understanding, of pure terror, appeared in the Persian's eyes. He had finally realized his mistake. He was not speaking to a politician, he was speaking to a wolf. Leonidas gestured toward the well. His voice, now rising to a full-throated roar that echoed off the stone buildings, was not a command but a judgment. Go and find it yourselves. The world exploded into motion. It was not a chaotic rage, but a coordinated, lethal action. Before the Persian guards could even draw their weapons, they were swarmed. Agesilaus was among the first, his massive hands seizing the anvil. Other Spartans descended on the guards, disarming and overpowering them with brutal efficiency. There was no negotiation, no further words. The envoy and his soldiers, screaming in a mixture of terror and outrage, were dragged, shoved, and kicked toward the well's gaping maw. Leonidas stood and watched, his face a mask of cold fury. The envoy was hurled screaming into the darkness, his cry cut short by a sickening, final splash. His retinue followed, one after another. When it was over, a profound silence fell once more. Leonidas turned to face his people, his chest rising and falling. His next words were for them alone, a declaration that would seal their fate. There will be no tribute. There will be no submission. We are Spartans. Let the tyrant king send his armies. They will find nothing here but shields and spears. They will find their graves. A single, unified roar of approval erupted from the crowd, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. It was the sound of a people choosing death over dishonor. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine, a mixture of terror and awe. The die was cast. War was no longer a rumor. It was a certainty. In the days that followed, Sparta transformed. The veneer of peace was stripped away, revealing the relentless war machine that lay beneath. The forges glowed day and night, the clang of hammer on bronze a constant rhythm. The training yards were filled from dawn until dusk. Every man, from the youngest recruit to the most grizzled veteran, prepared for the coming storm. But a shadow of a different kind hung over their preparations, the law. The Ephors, while sharing in the defiance, were slaves to tradition. It was the time of the Carnea, a sacred religious festival during which all warfare was forbidden. To march out with the full army would be an act of sacrilege that could bring the wrath of the gods down upon them. Furthermore, the oracle at Delphi, the most powerful spiritual authority in the Greek world, had been consulted. Her prophecy had been delivered to the Ephors, and its words were as cold and sharp as a shard of obsidian. Dilios, whose connections allowed him to hear such things, shared the news with Izuku and Agesilaus as they ate their evening meal. The Pythia has spoken, he said, his voice unusually somber. He tore a piece of hard bread, his hands for once not gesticulating. Her words were, "Hear your fate, O dwellers in Sparta of the wide spaces. Either your glorious town shall be sacked by the sons of Perseus, or, if that be not, the whole land of Lacedaemon shall mourn the death of a king of the house of Heracles." Agesilaus frowned, the complex prophecy tangling in his direct mind. "A king must die, or we all will," Izuku translated, the grim meaning crystal clear to him. The oracle offers a choice: sacrifice a king, or lose everything. The implications were staggering. It was a death sentence, either for Leonidas or for Sparta itself. The Ephors, bound by the prophecy and the law of the Carnea, had forbidden Leonidas from marching with the army. The political and religious stalemate was as dangerous as the Persian host. Sparta was paralyzed. It was 2 nights later that a summons came for Izuku. A member of the Hippias, the royal guard, stood at the entrance to their barracks, his crested helmet held under his arm. "The king wishes to see you. Bring your maps." Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. He carefully gathered his rolls of parchment and his notebooks and followed the guard through the torchlit streets. He was led not to the public council hall, but to the king's private residence, a home as simple and unadorned as any other, distinguished only by the 2 royal guards at its door. Inside, the room was Spartan in the truest sense of the word. A simple table, a few chairs, and a flickering oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. King Leonidas stood over the table, his arms crossed. With him were a handful of his most trusted commanders, their faces grim. The air was thick with frustration. "Chloros," Leonidas said, his voice low. He gestured to the table. "The Ephors have tied my hands. The law forbids me from taking the army. But the law allows a king to travel with his personal bodyguard." 300 Hippias. One of the commanders, a grizzled veteran named Gorgo, scoffed. 300 against 1,000,000. "It is not a battle, it is a sacrifice." Every battle is a sacrifice, Leonidas countered, his voice sharp. The question is whether the sacrifice is worthwhile. I will not sit here and wait for the Persians to burn our fields while our politicians and priests dither. I will march. I will meet them. But I must choose the ground. He turned his intense gaze on Izuku. You see the world through different eyes. You see lines and numbers where we see only hills and rivers. Show me where we make our stand. This was it. The moment his strange, otherworldly knowledge could either save them or damn them. Swallowing his nervousness, Izuku unrolled his largest map on the table. It was a painstakingly drawn representation of the Greek coastline, compiled from dozens of conversations with sailors and merchants. Great King, Izuku began, his voice steadier than he expected, the Persian army is a flood. To try and stop a flood on an open plain is madness. You do not build a dam in the middle of a field. You find the narrowest point in the river's path, a place where the flood is forced to become a trickle. His finger traced a path down the coastline. Their army must march south. Their navy must support them. The land here, he tapped a spot on the Malian Gulf, forces them into a bottleneck. The Kalidromos mountains press right up against the sea. There is only one path, a narrow track no wider than 2 wagons. The locals call it Thermopylae. He looked up, meeting Leonidas's eyes. The hot gates. We know the place, Gorgo grunted. A wretched pass. Good for ambushes, but not for a battle. That is where you are mistaken, Izuku said, growing more confident as he moved into the realm of pure logic. It is the perfect place for a battle, if the battle you intend to fight is not for victory, but for time. Think of it as a force multiplier. He paused, realizing the term was meaningless here. He rephrased. 1 Spartan in that pass is worth 100 Persians on an open field. Their numbers become their weakness. They will trip over each other. Their cavalry will be useless. Their archers will be firing at a wall of bronze in a compressed space. We can hold them there. He then unrolled another diagram, a cross-section of the pass he'd sketched based on a fisherman's description. There are 3 gates or narrow points. Here, at the middle gate, the pass is barely 50 feet wide. A phalanx of 300 men, 8 ranks deep, can plug that gap completely. It will be a wall of flesh and bronze that they cannot break and cannot go around. There is always a way around, Gorgo countered skeptically. There is, Izuku conceded, tapping a place in the mountains behind the pass. A path. The Anapia. But it is treacherous and easily defended. A small contingent of our allies, Phocians perhaps, could hold it for days. The main threat is here, in the pass itself. He looked at Leonidas, his voice filled with an urgent passion. King, with 300 Spartans, you can hold back the entire Persian army. Not forever. But for days, long enough to show all of Greece that the Persians are not gods. They are men, and they can bleed. You will light a fire of resistance that will unite the other city-states. Your sacrifice will buy them the one thing they need most, the will to fight. A long silence filled the room. The commanders stared at the map, then at Izuku, then at their king. Leonidas had not taken his eyes off the young outsider. He saw the fire in the boy's eyes, heard the irrefutable logic in his words. The king's own instincts had told him that the hot gates were the key, but Izuku had articulated it, proven it with a clarity that was almost prophetic. He saw the path forward, not to victory, but to a meaningful death that would fulfill the oracle's prophecy and save Sparta. Leonidas slowly nodded, a faint, grim smile on his lips. A wall of flesh and bronze, he repeated softly. The boy speaks sense. The hot gates it is. He clapped a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. Your mind is a sharper spear than any in this room, Chloros. I will need it. He then turned to his commanders. Gather the Hippias. Not just any 300. I want only those with living sons to carry on their names. This is a journey from which we will not return. The next day, in the pre-dawn chill, the chosen 300 assembled in the main square. A silent crowd of women, children, and old men watched, their faces etched with a mixture of pride and sorrow. This was the Spartan way. There were no tears, only a heavy, dignified grief. Leonidas stood before his men, his bronze armor gleaming in the light of the torches. His scarlet cloak was immaculate. He began to call the names, Each one answered with a sharp, "Here, King!" The names were a litany of Sparta's greatest families, heroes all. One by one, they stepped forward, their shields on their arms, their 8-foot spears held steady. Dilios, son of Ariston, "Here, King!" Dilios stepped forward, his usual flair replaced by a solemn gravity. Agesilaus, son of Cleomenes, "Here, King!" The giant moved to stand beside Dilios, his jaws set. The list went on, a roll call of the doomed. Izuku stood with his friends, his heart pounding. He had presented the plan. His duty was done. He would remain behind, his knowledge useless in a frontal assault. Leonidas called the 299th name. Then he paused. He surveyed the ranks of the chosen, his eyes sharp. His gaze swept over the crowd and found the one he was looking for. Chloros, son of no one. His voice boomed across the square. A shocked silence fell. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd and the assembled soldiers. Izuku froze, his blood turning to ice. "Me, King?" It was Gorgo, the veteran commander, who dared to speak. "This is an honor for the sons of Sparta. We go to die for the land of our fathers." The boy, he is not of Spartan blood. The objection was not malicious, but rooted in centuries of tradition. The 300 were to be the purest expression of Spartan sacrifice. An outsider had no place among them. Leonidas's gaze hardened. He turned to Gorgo, his voice dangerously low. "Did we not agree last night that the Persian horde cannot be stopped by spears alone? I am taking 300 of our finest warriors. I am taking their shields, their muscle, and their courage. But I am also taking our sharpest mind." He pointed a gauntlet finger directly at Izuku. "That boy's head is worth 1,000 spears. He sees the battlefield in a way none of us can. He will be my eyes. He will be the wit that guides our will. The blood in his veins matters less to me than the fire in his mind. He goes. My word is law." The finality in his tone was absolute. There would be no more debate. Dilios slapped Izuku's back, a jarring impact that brought him back to his senses. Agesilaus gave him a nod of encouragement, his eyes saying what his mouth could not, "We are with you." Trembling, Izuku picked up his shield and spear, his movements stiff and robotic. He walked forward and took his place in the ranks, the 300th man. The stares of the other hoplites were a physical weight. He was an anomaly, a disruption in their perfect, ordered world. As he stood there, the full weight of the moment crashed down upon him. 6 years ago, he was a quirkless, heartbroken boy on a rooftop in Muzurufu, told by his greatest idol that he could not be a hero. Now, he stood among the most legendary warriors in history, chosen by a king to march to a battle that would be sung about for millennia. He had been given a place in their epic, a role in their tragedy. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating surge of purpose. He was afraid, more afraid than he had ever been in his life. But beneath the fear was a bedrock of resolve. He was no longer astray. He was a Spartan. He was marching to protect his friends, to honor the trust of his king, and to defend the only home he had left. He gripped his spear, the worn leather cool against his palm, and looked towards the northern road, towards the coming shadow. He had finally found his chance to be a hero, and the price was everything. The sun had not yet risen when the 300 departed, but a pale, ghostly light bled over the peaks of Mount Taygetus, silhouetting the city in shades of gray and indigo. There was no grand ceremony, no cheering crowds. Sparta sent its warriors to battle not with fanfare, but with a heavy, profound silence that spoke more of duty than of glory. The women stood as still as statues, their faces veiled in the pre-dawn gloom, their hands clasped. They would not weep. A tear shed for a departing warrior was an insult, a suggestion that he might not be strong enough for the fate that awaited him. Izuku, now Chloros in all but his own thoughts, stood in the ranks, the weight of his gear a shocking, undeniable reality. For years he had trained with the Aspes, the great bronze shield that was the heart of the phalanx. He had drilled until his left arm was a knot of hardened sinew, capable of holding the 30-pound weight for hours. But now, marching towards a real and certain battle, it felt less like a tool and more like a tombstone he was forced to carry. His 8-foot dory was balanced on his shoulder, its leaf-shaped iron spearhead gleaming faintly in the torchlight. This was no longer theory. This was not a notebook. He caught the eye of Queen Gorgo, Leonidas's wife, as she stood beside her husband for a final, silent farewell. Her gaze was as sharp and intelligent as the king's. It swept over the men and for a moment it lingered on Izuku. There was no disdain in it, only a piercing, analytical curiosity. She was seeing what her husband saw, the anomaly, the wild card, the strange gear and the perfect Spartan machine. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not of encouragement, but of acknowledgement. It was enough. Leonidas turned from his wife, his face set like a bronze mask. He did not look back. "We march," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every man, and so they did. 300 pairs of sandals began their rhythmic crunch on the dusty road leading north, a sound that would be their constant companion for the next week. The silence held for the first mile, a shared meditation on the lives they were leaving behind. Izuku marched between Agesilaus and Dilios, their familiar presences a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Agesilaus' steps were heavy, solid, like a moving boulder. Dilios's were lighter, his eyes already scanning the landscape, undoubtedly composing the first verses of the epic he would one day tell. Izuku's mind, a frantic engine that never truly rested, was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. A part of him, the boy from Mizudafu, was screaming in sheer, unadulterated terror. He was marching to his death. He was going to be killed by arrows or spears in a brutal, primitive battle a world away from everything he had ever known. But another part of him, the man forged in the Agoge, was strangely calm. This was the logical culmination of his new life. He had been chosen. He had a purpose. He was no longer a spectator scribbling in a notebook. He was a piece on the board, a hoplite with a shield to hold and a duty to fulfill. The dichotomy was dizzying. He was both more terrified and more alive than he had ever been. As the sun rose, casting long shadows behind them, the rigid silence began to thaw. The men began to talk in low voices, sharing rough jokes or complaining about the dust. This was the famous Spartan nonchalance in the face of death, a carefully cultivated indifference that Izuku found both admirable and deeply alien. They were not marching to a slaughter. They were simply on another campaign, another day at work. The first challenge to Izuku's place among them came that evening, as they made their first camp. Lycomedes, his old instructor from the Agoge and now a senior officer among the 300, was assigning the night's watch. 2 men to a post, he barked, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering firelight. 4 posts. 4 shifts. You will not sleep on your watch. The first man I find with heavy eyelids will be whipped. It was the standard Spartan method, long, grueling shifts designed to test endurance. Izuku, watching from the edge of the fire, felt his analytical mind kick in, the old habit of mumbling returning to his lips. It's inefficient. Fatigue debt builds up. Alertness drops by half after the second hour. A single point of failure at each post. A hulking Spartan named Stelios, a man known more for his brute strength than his wit, overheard him. "What are you muttering about, outsider? Do you find our ways lacking?" His tone was aggressive, a clear challenge. Before Izuku could stammer a reply, Dilios gracefully intervened. "He is not questioning our ways, Stelios. He is merely counting the stars. His mind works in strange patterns, as you know." But Izuku, emboldened by the king's trust and the urgency of their mission, found a spine he didn't know he had. "No," he said, his voice clear, surprising even himself. "Stelios is right. I do find this way lacking." All conversation around the fire ceased. All eyes turned to him. Lycomedes turned slowly, his one good eye narrowing. "Explain yourself, Chloros. And choose your words with care." This was a critical moment. He could either retreat into the safety of being the quiet analyst, or he could prove his worth here and now. He took a breath. "Master Lycomedes," he began, using the respectful title from his training days, "a 4-hour watch for 2 men is a test of endurance. But our goal is not to endure the night, it is to remain alert. A man's senses are sharpest in the first hour. After that they dull. By the 3rd hour, a wild pig could wander through camp and he might mistake it for a shadow." He picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. "Instead of 2 men for 4 hours, we use 3 men for a 3-hour shift. 2 are static at the post. The 3rd man, the wolf, is not at the posts, but roams silently in the darkness between the posts for the first hour and a half. Then he swaps with one of the static men, who then becomes the wolf for the second half of the shift. The shifts are shorter, so fatigue is less. The roving man provides an unpredictable, moving sensor. It creates overlapping fields of observation and removes any single point of failure. It is a more secure, more efficient system. He looked up, his heart pounding. The Spartans around the fire stared at his diagram, then back at him. It was a complex, almost devious way of thinking. They were used to the simple, brute force logic of a shield wall. This was something else entirely, Stelios scoffed. Tricks and complications. A Spartan stands his ground. He does not wander in the dark like a helot. A dead Spartan stands no ground at all, Izuku countered, his voice sharp. A heavy silence descended. Lycomedes stared at the diagram in the dirt, his face a granite mask. He was a man of tradition, of the old ways, but he was also the man who had witnessed Izuku's victory at the Cryptia. He had seen firsthand what the boy's unorthodox thinking could achieve. From the shadows near the king's tent, a figure emerged. It was Leonidas. He had been listening the entire time. He walked over and looked down at the drawing. The boy's logic is sound, the king declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. We are not on a training field. We are at war. We will use the best methods, not just the oldest ones. We will try the wolf watch. He looked directly at Izuku, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. You will take the first watch, Chloros. Show them how it is done. The matter was settled. The challenge had been met and overcome. As Izuku walked into the darkness with Dilios and Agesilaus for their shift, he felt a profound shift in the air. He had not just won an argument, he had earned a new measure of respect. He was not just a mascot for the king, he was an active, contributing part of this army. His mind was his weapon, and he had just proven it could be as valuable as any spear. The march continued, a relentless journey north through the rugged heart of the Peloponnese. They moved through Arcadia, its green hills and cool forests a stark contrast to the barren plains of Laconia. Here, they began to encounter other Greeks. Small bands of warriors from Tegea and Mantinia, hearing of the Spartans' march, came out to join them. Their arrival was always the same. They would approach the Spartan column with a mixture of awe and trepidation, their own armor and discipline seeming shoddy and chaotic next to the silent, red-cloaked professionals. Their leaders would speak to Leonidas, pledging their handful of men to the cause. Leonidas would accept them with a gruff nod, but it was clear to all who was in command. The 300 were the hard, sharp tip of the spear. The allies were merely the wooden shaft. It was during a river crossing that Izuku demonstrated his next innovation. The allied contingent, a group of excitable thespians, were trying to get their supply cart across the ford, shouting contradictory orders, causing a bottleneck that delayed the entire column. Izuku watched the chaos, his brow furrowed in thought. Vocal commands in a confusing environment were unreliable. Shouts could be misheard, lost in the rush of water or the din of a battle. There had to be a better way. Later that day, during a rest stop, he took Dilios and Agesilaus aside. The voice is a clumsy tool, he explained. It is slow and imprecise. We need something faster. He held up his hand, fist clenched. This means halt or hold position. He then opened his hand, palm forward. Shields up. Prepare for impact. He made a sharp, jabbing motion with 2 fingers, spears forward. Attack. He developed a dozen simple, unambiguous signals for the most common battlefield commands: form phalanx, advance, will left, controlled retreat, javelins, archers. Dilios was fascinated. Silent commands. The language of the hand. It has a certain poetry to it. Agesilaus, a more practical man, just grunted. Seems simple enough. Less shouting is good. My throat is raw from yelling at you too. They demonstrated the system to their Sicilian mates. At first there was skepticism, but when Izuku directed them through a series of complex drills, forming a line, splitting into 2, reforming, and charging, all without a single word being spoken, the utility became undeniable. The movements were faster, more fluid, and eerily silent. A phalanx that could maneuver without shouting was a terrifyingly unpredictable weapon. Leonidas observed the drill, his arms crossed. He summoned Izuku. "This is your invention?" "It is an adaptation, King," Izuku said honestly, "from things I remember. A way to bring order to noise." "Teach it to the other officers," Leonidas commanded. "All of them. And to the allies. They will need it more than we do." By the time they reached the Isthmus of Corinth, the small army of 300 Spartans and their growing contingent of allies had a rudimentary but effective system of hand signals. Izuku had, in the space of a few days, fundamentally altered the way these men communicated in battle. He felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by a grim reality. He was optimizing a machine designed for killing, making these good men more efficient at the bloody work that awaited them. The closer they got to Thermopylae, the heavier the tension became. The epic scale of the Persian threat was no longer a distant rumor. Frightened refugees heading south spoke of an army that moved like a plague across the land, of a navy whose sails were so numerous they blocked out the sun. Fear was a palpable thing, a cold mist that clung to the edges of the camp each night. But it did not seem to touch the Spartans. They sharpened their swords, polished their shields, and told their grim jokes. Their discipline was the antidote to fear. As long as they had their routine, their brothers, their king, the fear had no purchase. Izuku, however, felt it keenly. He didn't have the lifetime of indoctrination that they did. His fear was not for himself alone, but for these men he had come to call his brothers. For Dilios, whose stories deserved to be told for decades to come. For Agesilaus, whose simple, honest strength was a rock in this chaotic world. For Leonidas, a king who was willingly marching to his own prophesied doom to save his people. His analytical mind saw the brutal math of their situation, and it terrified him. 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies against a force that might number in the hundreds of thousands. He knew the phalanx was their greatest weapon. A perfectly disciplined, overlapping wall of shields and spears. It was an unbreakable formation, but only as long as it remained intact. Izuku's greatest fear was a breach. A single enemy warrior breaking through the line could cause a catastrophic ripple effect, turning the organized phalanx into a chaotic mob. The night before they were due to arrive at the hot gates, he approached Leonidas again. The king was alone, staring into the flames of a small fire, his great shield leaning against his stool. "King," Izuku said, his voice low. "May I speak?" Leonidas nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Your mind is working again, Chloros. I can see it in your eyes. What flaw have you found now?" "The phalanx itself," Izuku said. "Its strength is its unity. Its weakness is that a single break in the line can unravel the whole formation from the inside out. We train to plug the gap, but the moments it takes to do so are the most vulnerable," Leonidas grunted. "This is the nature of the shield wall. It has been so for 100 years. It is a risk we accept. But what if we could turn that weakness into a strength?" Izuku pressed, leaning forward, his eyes alight with the fire of his idea. "What if, instead of just plugging the breach, we drilled the men to react to it differently? The moment an enemy breaks through, the two men on either side of the gap, and the man directly behind them, do not just close ranks. They instantly become a separate, three-man unit. A thorn. Their sole purpose is not to rejoin the line, but to attack and destroy whatever came through, to create chaos in the enemy's rear. The men behind them then step up to seal the wall. We would be creating a system of controlled chaos inside our own lines." He grabbed a handful of pebbles and laid them out in two neat lines, representing the phalanx. He took one pebble away. The breach. Then he moved the three adjacent pebbles into a triangle. The thorn. It attacks the enemy that just broke through. It becomes a small, vicious cell of aggression inside the wound. It turns their success into a trap. Leonidas stared at the pebbles, his brow furrowed. The idea was radical, almost heretical. It went against the core principle of the phalanx, which was absolute, unified cohesion. This plan called for men to act as individuals, to deliberately break formation for a tactical purpose. "It is ugly," the king said after a long silence. "It is chaotic. War is chaotic, King," Izuku replied softly. "This plan acknowledges that. It uses the enemy's chaos against them. It would require immense discipline to break formation and then reform on instinct, but if any men in the world can do it, it is the men in this camp. Leonidas picked up the 3 pebbles Izuku had designated as the thorn. He rolled them in his palm. It was a gamble. A drill this complex, taught the night before a major battle, could confuse the men, disrupt the discipline he had spent a lifetime instilling. But he also saw the savage genius of it. He remembered the Cryptia, how Chloros had used deception and chaos to defeat a superior force. Tomorrow at dawn, Leonidas said, his voice firm. We will drill it. We will call it the hedgehog's quill. When the beast's hide is pierced, it offers only more spines. He looked at Izuku, and for the first time, the king's eyes held something more than just respect for a tool. It was a look of genuine wonder. Who are you, boy, to have a mind that thinks such things? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and profound. The campfire crackled, spitting embers into the darkness. I am from a land, very far from here, Izuku said, choosing his words carefully. A land of peace, bought at a great price long ago. A place with different kinds of heroes. Leonidas leaned forward, his interest piqued. Tell me. In your land, what is a hero? Izuku looked into the flames, and the image of All Might, smiling and triumphant, flashed in his mind, followed by the crushing memory of his words on the rooftop. He had spent years wrestling with that question, deconstructing it, trying to find a version of it that could include him. In my homeland, he began, his voice barely a whisper, there are stories of men who could fly, men as strong as 100 warriors, men who could command the elements. They were symbols. They were hope. He paused, the old pain a dull ache in his chest. But I have come to believe that is not the true definition. A hero is just someone who saves others. That is the only measure. He looked up from the fire and met the king's gaze. His own green eyes were filled with a conviction that was absolute, forged in the crucible of his own inadequacies. It doesn't matter if you are strong or weak, a king or a commoner. If you see someone in trouble, and you act to help them, you are a hero. The goal is not to win, not to earn glory, not to defeat an enemy. The goal is to protect. To stand in the way of harm, to shield the innocent, to save one more life, even if it costs you your own. That is all it is. And it is everything. Leonidas was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on Izuku. The boy's words were simple, stripped of all the glory and honor and tradition that Spartans cloaked themselves in, and yet they resonated with a truth so profound it struck the king to his very core. He had been raised on the epic tales of Heracles, on the glory of dying for Sparta, but Chloros had just given voice to the pure, unvarnished ideal that lay beneath it all. To protect. To stand in the way. To die for the man next to you. You have a strange way of speaking, boy, Leonidas said, his voice a low rumble. You strip the poetry from a warrior's purpose and leave only the hard, bare stone of it. And yet, it is the truest thing I have ever heard. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on Izuku's shoulder. You may not have been born of a Spartan mother, Chloros, but your psyche, your spirit, it is forged of pure Laconian iron. You have a place here. The king's acceptance was a balm on a wound Izuku hadn't realized was still so raw. He had found his answer, not on a rooftop in Muzurifu, but by a campfire on the eve of his own destruction. The next morning, they arrived. The pass at Thermopylae was exactly as Izuku had described it from the maps, yet so much more. It was a claustrophobic, oppressive place. To their left, the sheer, impassable cliffs of Mount Kalidromos clawed at the sky. To their right, the slate-gray waters of the Malian Gulf churned and hissed against the narrow, rocky shore. The air was thick with the smell of salt and sulfur from the hot springs that gave the pass its name. The track itself was a choked, narrow ribbon of land, a natural funnel. This was the place. The hot gates. The end of the road. Izuku stood with the 300, looking down the pass to the north. Soon that path would be filled with the endless tide of the Persian army. This narrow, miserable strip of land would be their home, their fortress, and their tomb. He felt a hand clap his shoulder. It was Agesilaus. The giant was not smiling. His face was set, calm, and ready. On his other side Dilios stood watching the sea, his expression thoughtful. A fine place to die, Dilios murmured, as if commenting on the quality of a vintage of wine. "We are not here to die," Agesilaus said, his voice a low growl. "We are here to kill." Izuka looked from one to the other, his shield brothers, his family. And he knew his own purpose. He was here to do both. He was here to die, so that others might live. He was here to kill, so that his brothers might survive one moment longer. He was a hero. Finally, he gripped the shaft of his spear, the worn wood familiar and solid in his hand, and stared into the empty north. "Let them come,"